Good afternoon. My name is Javier Bayard. I'm going to make a conceptual presentation on governance and public policies. Before talking about governance and public policies, I wanted to introduce these two ideas a bit that I've placed on the slide. Well, on one hand, we think that it's important, at least for the people, for those of us that worked on an index project last year that my colleague Sergio will present later, the idea of including disaster risk management in public policy. This may seem obvious, but we think that the idea of risk management has maybe not been that clearly included in all the governments. Here we're talking about national governments, also sectoral and local governments. So the inclusion of risk management surely highly depends on the capacity of these institutions. It depends a lot on the capacity to implement public policies, the public policies of these institutions, and this is something that is very important. As we've said many times, we need strong institutionalization to be able to include this in management. Another thing I wanted to mention is the index that we've called IGOP to measure the efficacy of the reforms that are promoted by countries in this sense. So you can see that they have been organized by several indicators that will be explained later. But just to give you a brief idea, which is the idea, well, when we talk about assessing the efficacy of something, for example, this idea that we've talked so much about here, which is risk reduction, this idea, this objective to reduce risks is difficult to assess. It is an important topic. Reducing risks is very important, but however, our capacity to measure is very limited. So this is something that we must bear in mind and consider when something is easy to measure. It's normally less interesting, less important. And when something is difficult to measure, it's obviously more important. Okay, let's advance a bit. The second idea that I wanted to mention before going into governance and public policies is the idea that we can practically think that risk management, in that sense, could be conceived as a problem, as a wicked problem, to refer to problems that many times go beyond the capacity of administrations. So we have to clarify a series of objectives. Here we've talked a lot about prevention, mitigation, reduction, obviously response as well. But to summarize, this is indeed a very complex matter. You know it even better than I do. And in fact, in IGOP, I think that there's a polyhedric characteristic to this. It has several faces, and it's what I'm showing here on the screen: how to reduce risk, how to prepare for risk, plan it, identify it, plan the public expenditure that may be generated. And these are all different aspects. They are different faces that if we respond to one, or if we look one way, maybe we're not responding that well to the other, and that's why this is so complex, and it's difficult for public administrations to work on this. Okay, let's talk about governance, and maybe to understand governance a bit better, we can say, what is non-governance? Well, political science literature has associated this to situations in which administrations, as I said before, have problems or are overwhelmed, and this was traditionally associated to excessive burden in administrations. They don't have enough capacities or have difficulties facing complex problems, as I said, with many faces. So what is governance? Governance is actually the way in which power is exerted, and this can be in many ways. So here, well, we don't have much time right now, but we're going to look a bit at this idea that results from the work of the European Union, World Bank, and other international institutions. that are promoting balance between the state's actions, the actions of civil society and of companies and in general society. Why? Because we see that public administrations obviously have two instruments to act: public authority and public resources. But they obviously don't have many. They're in many cases limited, and that's why we see the need to mobilize resources beyond this public authority and these public resources. So what would governance be? It's the pattern that results from all of this. So it would mean the capacity to govern all these things. And here we're talking, as I said before, of a complex problem. Well, what else? Two more aspects of governance. First, consequences, we can say. A first consequence would be that governors or rulers have to change their role, their mindset, that beyond exerting power in a bureaucratic, authoritarian, vertical way, maybe governors or rulers have to learn how to be facilitators, promoters, seek resources, and somehow find partners and cooperation. And this has another consequence, which is to distribute responsibilities. When you have authority, you don't want to let go, and when you have money, it's hard to let go. And, well, this idea of passing on responsibilities to local administrations is very important, but also to the civil society and to companies that can make an important contribution. Then the need to strengthen in local and regional institutions so that they can carry out this role as facilitators, as a link. And a word that is used a lot in Europe when we talk about these things is this partnership, this idea of association, public-private association, to advance on this. And the last thing that I wanted to insist on, speaking of governance, is, well, I mentioned it a bit, both dimensions, a vertical and a horizontal one. The vertical one I already mentioned, and it's the idea of a creation of horizontal links of territorial agreements or pacts to include this DRR, include non-public agents of civil society or the private sector in this. There's also a vertical dimension. There's always a vertical dimension. So with this, when we refer to this, we're talking about the different levels of administration. If it's local, state, but the idea that we're trying to transmit here is that we cannot develop a policy if we don't work together with other levels of the government. And I specifically insist, at least in this sector and from what we've done in the past year and a half, local governments are very important. And well, of course, local governments can act if they have resources for it. If they have resources and money, if they have human resources, if they have technical capacities, and if they have financial capacities. And it's logical for them to want to participate because due to proximity, they've been highly impacted by all these things. Okay, let's advance a bit with public policies. Here I've chosen one by phases.
Phase is the definition of the problem, the second. And so before I've spoken a little bit about the five or the several phases that we're dealing with right now, and that things that will be translated in the index that will be distributed later. And here the idea is more or less to say if we are capable of generating indicators and measurements, then of course maybe generating surveys. Maybe also this will change the perception of the problem. It can probably change the perception in those who are governing, and this will facilitate inclusion in the agenda of the risk management topic. And this would be the first thing. And the second phase would be referred to the inclusion of the agents of the government's agenda. And other aspects that can facilitate this inclusion would be to have a more active management and political leadership, a management that will be able to act and to and in this regard, perhaps it does influence the fact that there is a pressure from the society on a social and political and economic level. But other aspects can also be can also influence. For instance, these networks that we're working on. For instance, the one here that is an encounter between policymakers, economists, and educators, and so on and so forth, and technical people. So all of these experiences that we're sharing here, that are concrete experiences that are in political leadership, is very important. Therefore, the content, the issue, is the inclusion of this in the government's agendas, in these for these policies to be implemented. And of course, then the other phase would be implementation, and this has a lot to do with governance. It is very important, as important, because as important are the government instances, local, regional, provincial, and the networks and their relations with the stakeholders and the society at large. And so there will be governance if we have in the end, if we have whole organization of enterprises and stakeholders that are weaving this fabric. And another thing is perhaps something that is subject to several opinions and there are many possible schemes, and especially this idea of governance on a regional level. There is another topic that crosses across, and this is the cross-sectional issue. In other words, that we would like all sectors to have this idea that this would be like a cross-sectional item. But this, and everybody wants it, young people, senior citizens, environmental issues, everybody, all of these issues want to be cross-sectional. And we would say that management, risk management and climate change should be the total strategy that would take into account all the different areas of government and all the mechanisms. However, it's something very difficult because we know that governments cannot manage all kinds of cross-sectional items at once, and it's rather a utopia. But it is a cross-sectional item, in fact, for society, and the success is really dependent upon the ability to implement vertically and also horizontally through the civil society. And of course, this is very easy to say, but it's very hard to do. And this means also that a government may have a discourse that then is not really supporting the local governments, and that is in the discourse they are asking for cooperation. And of course, the local governments always complain that what if I don't have authority, and if I don't have resources, and it's little, but I can do it, and so on and so forth. And so sometimes the governments don't know how to do things. That's what the criticism is about. And we do have to learn from experiences, and we need to be able to disseminate the experiences so that others can learn from it and how others do things. And finally, evaluation or assessment, where we only have a minute for this, but the point is to analyze and compare the public policies. And in assessing, we need to see the needs. We need to assess and evaluate the necessities, the needs of a population. And another one is to assess implementation, which we have seen here. We are actually having horizontal, vertical implementation, and it has to do with the management and the activities that are developed, and we always see impact. In reality, here we have on the screen, we could analyze what would have happened if the policy had not been in place. As we compared to what actually happened. And so this morning we saw that you have done some exercises here on a local level, and in this morning we've heard about that. But it is very hard to come up with a really accurate analysis. And in a way, in a very simple manner, very simply put, as Lizardo has just said, well, what is to evaluate? What is to assess? It is to compare to and compare with others, with other situations that do not escape your control. And this can be represented as we have it here. A point after or before, and a series of points before or after, if we have the possibility to compare with something that is very similar and that is I don't know, municipalities, regions, provinces, cantons, so they're all different. But the idea is then to compare with somebody else and something else. And if I say, well, I've advanced, and then the other one has remained at the same place, well, then there is the differential impact. And if we have several points for one, for others, for many, and if you have 4, 5, 20, then it's much better. What does this have to do with what is to come? In reality, it is a little bit the attempt to collect data for a series of countries on a series of items and issues, and then of course compare and contrast. And for other countries, and when we have reforms and more reforms, then things improve. Whether things do not improve, and if we improve it as compared to others. Thank you very much for your attention. And if we have more time, then we'll have time to discuss this a little further. Thank you.